Hi everyone, welcome to lecture guide number 6. What we're going to deal with today in today's lecture has to do with something that sets up photography in quite a different way than we talked about it most recently when we were talking about the kind of trajectory and evolution of photography in terms of formalism and art for art's sake. So if you think back to what we were talking about then, about how people started to conceive of photography, kind of extending ideas that were already in play in the pictorialist tradition. People like Alfred Stieglitz, for instance, and Ed Weston and Paul Strand and so forth. What they were doing and what critics were doing is associating photography with modernism, right? Thinking very in great depth about photography, frankly, on the first order as something that created a kind of aesthetic, pleasurable experience for us that was all about the formal components of photography. Line and shape and tonal value and detail and texture and lighting and spatial systems and composition. Didn't have anything to do, remember, as they argued, with the subject matter per se. So someone like Ed Weston could, spend hours photographing a toilet and think it's not about a toilet at all, it's about the lighting and the beauty of this object. Or, in the image that we have on the screen here, someone like Alfred Stieglitz could take a photograph of an ocean liner that clearly juxtaposes those who have on the top, people with means and money, with those on the bottom who have nothing, right? People who are either being sent back to Europe because they're not wanted in the US or something of that sort, and say this photograph has absolutely nothing to do, at least at the level of his intention, what he was striving for in this photograph, has nothing to do with the social order or the way that the world sets up a system in which some people are considered to be desirables and others are undesirable, either because of their race or their poverty or their illiteracy or what have you. In other words, photography as a kind of formalist exercise, photography in the beginning of the 20th century being attached to modernist art and abstraction, argued, as I said last week, that the whole reason for photography and its existence was to create this aesthetic emotion in us. Yeah. So we call that type of thinking formalism. I gave you a reading by John Sarkowski about how he said, listen, if you're looking at a photograph, these are the intrinsic qualities of a photograph that a lot of early 20th century photographers were paying a lot of attention to. Remember, this has to do again with the idea that goes through modernism that each art form, and frankly each discipline, each kind of realm of knowledge, had to determine what were its intrinsic essential qualities and draw from those as its strengths. Not overlapping with other art forms, so photography and painting try to separate themselves, right? But trying to draw upon what those intrinsic properties are. But the bigger thing to keep your eye on here is how photography is valued. So if you're a formalist, if you're a modernist in this way, if you're thinking that what matters about photography is its aesthetic, then the way that you're valuing photography is based upon what is often called its intrinsic qualities. You think that photography's reason for being is to create an aesthetic experience for you, and that's what is good about photography. It's an art, yeah? Another way, in broad terms, that photography, of course, had been valued since the very beginning, and that's the story we're looking at today, is for its instrumental value. Now, philosophers call the instrumental value of something that value that we ascribe to something because it can be an instrument for something else. And in this case, the photographers that we'll be looking at today, for the very most part, were interested in using photography to raise our consciousness about various social issues in the world. They were seeking to use photography and the way that it documented and could report on various realities, make them concrete and tangible and things that we could all hold up and look at together and say, we don't like that, to change the world in which they lived. Now, I want to say at the outset that my lecture is going to focus primarily on what the goals of these photographers were and how they went about in their each individual ways trying to achieve these goals through photography. But I have given you a reading that is a very, very good reading by a contemporary artist and theorist who began practicing, and we'll see her work coming up fairly soon, began practicing in the 60s using photography and frankly using a lot of other kind of performance means in order to change the world. Martha Rossler is her name, who wants to draw our attention to all the ways that photography can also, even when it's very well intentioned, not necessarily serve the purposes that we hope for it to serve. In other words, just because you take a photograph of someone who is in dire need of help doesn't mean that that photograph necessarily will contribute to any real change in the world. And she very systematically takes us through some of the fallacies that have been in play in documentary or reporting photography for a very, very long time. But again, I'm going to leave that up to her to give the critical pushback to the lecture that I'm giving for you today. Okay, so like with any, as I've said a couple of times before, as with any course that is trying to be a survey of a very long period of time, we obviously can't cover every single great photographer who is interested in using photography as a mechanism for social change. We're going to hit some of the highlights that allow us to talk about some of the bigger ideas. So the first photographer I would like you to entertain and for us to think about is Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis is an interesting character. He was a man who was an immigrant. He came into the United States during a massive wave of immigration that actually started in the 1880s, a little bit before that even, and continued into the first decade or so of the 20th century. Most of these immigrants, of course, were passing through New York by way of Ellis Island, which was one of the major vetting destinations for allowing immigrants in. But just frankly, as those of you who are historians or know something about the history of the United States vis-a-vis immigration will know that our contemporary moment is not alone, in which people expressed an incredible anxiety, or at least some people expressed an incredible anxiety about immigration. And we see this all over the world today. This time period that we're looking at was one of the first moments in which this kind of mass, oftentimes distaste for immigration really came to a head. It had happened before, but this moment is singular in a couple of things. One of them is that the number of immigrants that were coming into the United States, between the kind of late 1870s and the first decade of the 20th century was larger than any moment in history. We're getting, frankly, millions coming in over the course of, a year or so, or at least trying to come in. The other complicating factor, which was different than earlier moments of immigration, was that these immigrants were oftentimes coming into the United States. They're kind of the working poor with very low literacy rates, very low education rates. They don't appear to have much to offer immediately off the bat, one would say, other than raw labor in the United States. And because they didn't have English, many anyway, great English language skills, they tended to stick together. They didn't kind of meld in, as was the case with some earlier moments of mass immigration. And so you have these huge numbers of people who had very little access to the ability to kind of integrate into everyday American life, whatever that would be, who had kind of limited possibilities for social mobility, who tended to stick together, and frankly who got exploited when they made it in, and and it became a big social issue. Jacob Riis was a part of one of these immigrant kind of migrations. Jacob Riis was Danish-born. When he came to the United States, for about 3 years, he really just couldn't find a job. I kicked around from one thing to the next until finally he started getting a few kind of minor jobs. He was an evangelist, so a Christian who sought social change and believed, frankly, and this is a big idea for today, he believed in reform rather than revolution. And just about everyone you're going to look at today had this same idea, with maybe, in his kind of more extreme moments, the artist Gordon Parks near the end of today's lecture. In any case, the reason that I bring this up is that reform movements, what they're trying to do is, let's say, raise consciousness about an issue, but not necessarily completely change the social circumstances that led to this issue in the first place. So let's say you've got extreme poverty, you've got illiteracy, you've got mixed in with that people being exploited, you've got a lot of racism and prejudice against these people. What someone who's a reformer believes is if you can just give them the tools to better their lives and, frankly, raise the consciousness of people who are already benefiting from the social system as it exists, meaning people with money, people who are established, you will basically slowly but surely bring them into a system that already exists, right? So capitalism, democracy, we always think of these things as great things, but I think we know they don't. Actually, I should say it this way. I believe that they don't always function the way that you want them to function. They oftentimes generate and engender some pretty hideous things like massive, ethnic disparities, lots of prejudice, lots of wealth disparities, and so forth. In any case, a reformist then basically banks on the idea that if you raise the consciousness of people who already are benefiting from the system, they will help those that are not enter into the system. And for Jacob Riis, as with many others, this either means, and in his case it meant primarily charity, or it means getting people who are in positions of power to change, let's say, social norms or municipal laws, or even, if you're being very ambitious, national laws, so as to rectify some social injustice. Yeah, so just kind of basic ideas. So Jacob Riis, in the 1880s, kind of later 1880s, according to myth anyway, came across an advertisement for a camera that allowed people to take snapshots. This is a handheld camera. Take snapshots in the dark. It was basically a flash camera, and the way that it worked was that, I don't know if you've seen those old movies where they basically light off gunpowder to create a large flash and then take the photograph at the same time. It was like that, but you would fire the gunpowder out of a kind of little musket thing in the dark to capture these scenes that he wanted to capture. And what he wanted to capture was scenes of the difficulties that were facing these newly arrived immigrant populations, particularly in parts of the Lower East Side, where he first worked on Mulberry Bend as a police reporter and then worked for various types of small-scale newspapers and so forth, capturing these scenes. And the flash was really important because these were really poor lit scenes. They're in dark alleys, they're in darkened interiors, and of course we know that the technology at this time wasn't very conducive to that. The other thing, though, that's going on at the same time that's very important for us, and what you're looking at here is a work called 5 cents a spot. This is a cheap place that you can get for, I don't remember, I think it was for, rent it for a week, 5 cents for these really, really cheap, basically tenement buildings. The other thing that's going on at this time, getting a little ahead of myself, the other thing that's going on at this time is a couple of new printing technologies develop that allow for people to print very cheaply photographs for periodical publication pretty rapidly. Remember, we said that during the Civil War, one of the problems was you could take a photograph, but it took a lot of work to turn that photograph into something that was reproducible in a magazine or a newspaper. But at this time, photographic forms of printing technologies, photolithography, and in particular something known as the half-tone print process, a very cheap, low-budget printing process, could fairly rapidly turn photographs into prints and make them widely distributable through the various weekly periodicals or socialist types of newspapers, which is where many of his works found their distribution, so you could get them out there. Jacob Riis, though, was also a lecturer. He was an evangelist. He used religious ideas that were accompanied by both his photographs and photographs taken by others in big magic lantern slideshows, so as to, again, raise the consciousness of people who would see these photographs. His basic idea was, and this is kind of standard thinking for various photographers who are interested in using photography to raise social consciousness, is that if you show people how horrible these living conditions are, people will want to change them. And so he would show up in these interiors, sometimes announced, sometimes not announced, and try to capture candid pictures of the people in these scenes. So when you're seeing these photographs and you're like, there's all this extra stuff in there, the guys don't have their eyes open, half of them are sleeping. He didn't care about those things. He just wanted you to get the feeling of how difficult this life was. So here is, you take that photograph. One form of printing technology was a drawing process where you basically put a transparent plate over the top of a photograph and copy it very quickly and turn that into a print that then you could print in a paper. Now notice something about this, and I'll put these, of course, in the images for this lecture, as I always do, that a lot of the extra stuff that was in the original photograph gets taken out, kind of simplified, and when Riis was taking these photographs, he of course knew that primarily they would be distributed as certain types of prints, and so getting the perfect photograph didn't matter. You could kind of clean it up when it came to the printing process and really just focus on the things that you thought were going to draw attention to the plight of these people. So, this kind of type of printing process, the halftone, began in the 1880s. This Morgan method, as it was sometimes called. This is the first of those halftone prints. They're very, very low quality prints of photographs. But, what this did was it made it possible to think of photography in the way that we think of it as today, as a kind of report, that you could take a photograph and put it into a newspaper accompanied with various stories, and it would help you to understand the subject that you were dealing with here. So I'm going to show you a few of these photographs by Riis. Again, when their eyes are closed, this flash, it's not something that's really going to allow for a perfectly posed picture like we've been seeing in the work of Stieglitz or Weston. It's going to capture what it captures, and again, it's not meant to be artistic. It doesn't need to be a perfect composition, but it needs to do, according to people like Riis and Hine and those artists associated with the Great Depression, is to document or to show us the difficulty of these people's way of life. So one of the places that immigrants oftentimes, if they didn't have any money, found themselves staying was in the police station, where you would stay, on basically a board would be your bed, last kind of resort. So here are some more police lodgers, right? 1890 or so. Primarily recent immigrants with no other place to stay. And so Riis is thinking, again, not to beat a dead horse here, that if we see this, if we see how horrible their life is, and by us he means those who are doing okay, we will pool our resources or put pressure on the system as it exists to not tolerate this degree of inequity, of difficulty, will try to do something to change their lot in life. It's not revolutionary. It's not saying the system's wrong. It's always going to reproduce these conditions. It is meant to be a reform. We can fix the system. A lot of Jacob Riis's photographs focused on the tenement buildings that cropped up all over the east side, the Lower East Side, again, where he worked on Mulberry Bend. At this time, just to give you an idea of what the numbers are, we're getting, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million immigrants living in about 37,000 tenement buildings. Now, tenements, as you can see here, are kind of high-rise, multi-occupation, almost like crappy hotels or something like that, with very, very poor, you can see it, right? Very, very poor structure, very, very poor lighting, very, very cramped. And it was where we kind of piled up all of the immigrants during this time who couldn't afford to go anywhere else. And then they were all stuck in these areas with very little access to changing their lot in life, and various prejudices will develop around, ethnic and racial stereotypes of these groups. And again, think of what he's showing you here. This is the interior of this woman's home, an Italian rag picker, late 1880s, right? The thing that she's holding in her hand is a baby. And her job is to basically, to make what she can out of using up old fabric to make new garments and such. Figured if you see this way of life, you'll want to change it. Now, he was a police reporter as well, and you might be able to tell from this photograph, but of course these people aren't all that excited to have their photograph taken. He would just kind of run through these scenes, take a quick snapshot with his flash camera, meaning lighting off these kind of flashes, take that picture and then run the other way before these people got too angry with him. Bandits Roots, New York, 1888. Or, you can see, and this is what he wanted you to get, these young kids who are eventually going to grow up to be like these older men, finding themselves in basically gangs and, earning a living because there wasn't much else to do to find any kind of degree of access to wealth in ways that were illegal, that then of course just generated more of these ideas about the immigrant populations being immoral and undisciplined and lazy and criminal. Near the end of his career, he began producing a number of texts, with these ideas, accompanied with his own writings on the subject, and one of them was known as Americans in the Raw, which you're looking at here. The other one that came from the early 1890s, I think it was actually published in 1890, was something known as How the Other Half Lives. So you could buy these kind of cheap printed texts that would be primarily pictures, but also have reformist language in there about what to do to change these people's lot in life. This was called, in general, by the way, muck raking, right? You draw attention to the muck, to all the difficulties that are occurring in society. You raise enough of enough issues around these things so that people really pay attention to them and want to change them. I'm going to pause here for a minute. Excuse me, I'll be right back to talk about Lewis Hine. So now we move on to another photographer who was also interested in using photography for an instrument for social change. He's one of the big early, very well-known names, Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine gained his education at the University of Chicago. He was basically a sociologist, before that term was really particularly coined. He then moved to New York, where he was basically a teacher in sociology at Columbia University. He went on to have a number of other teaching positions as well during the same time period. including working at something known as the Ethical Cultural School, which is kind of like a working man's school with an emphasis on industrial education and manual training. So, his entire life was devoted to seeking to rectify some of the injustices that he saw in the world, some of the inequities that were out there. And we'll see a lot of this in his photographs. Lewis Hines a little bit different than Rees. I always think of him as a bit more kind of, I don't want to say detached in the same way, but he's not in your business. Like Rees would just kind of burst into, supposedly anyway, burst into a tenement house and shoot someone's picture without asking them for it. His photographs aren't particularly well posed. He just wanted to capture that info using whatever means that he could. Whereas Lewis Hine, his photographs are going to come across as slightly more detached, a little bit perhaps more objective. He wanted to, he called himself an interruptive photographer. He wanted to interrupt the system that was reproducing these kinds of inequities. And so he just thought of photography as a tool to get those interruptions to occur. So Lewis Hines gets, his first major photographs, or the ones that he's best known for early in his career, were photographs that he took at Ellis Island of recent immigrants coming in through, of course, this major hub. He's different than many of the other photographers during this time that also took photographs of Ellis Island. After all, there was a kind of market for photographs of the exotic other coming to the United States and these kind of strange immigrant populations. And a lot of photographers were out there kind of in the very pictorialist tradition, taking these photographs that could be put to various usages, including just straight out exoticism, like aren't these people a little odd looking, to things that confirmed suspicions about racial stereotypes and basically promulgated various prejudices at the time. Now, Lewis Hines wanted to change that. And so when he was taking these photographs of people at Ellis Island, what he tried to do and what he talked about, and you'll read about some of this both in your text as well as in the short reading I gave you by Hines, is to add a little bit of dignity to these people. He wanted to give you a sense of who they were as a person, to show you and to correct the way that these racial stereotypes had cropped up, to correct that, but also show you something of their humanity. And so, for instance, here we see a photograph that was titled Young Russian Jewess at Ellis Island. Now, other photographers might have shown you her in profile and played up the idea of racial stereotypes about Jewish hooked noses and dirty masses and so forth. But he shows you her kind of straight on, framed in this photograph very nicely like any other portrait, and gives her a little bit of human dignity. And we'll see a few of these here, right? Women with a folded headcloth, Ellis Island, staring right back at the camera as a form of kind of reciprocal exchange, someone who's acknowledging that they're okay with having their photograph taken, and something that gives you a sense of perhaps their humanity. And he did this with all of them, but he also wanted to show you a little bit of their hardships as well. So here is a family who's looking around for their lost baggage or trying to find their way. And, it doesn't take much to then follow these people from Ellis Island to where they end up. This is a row of tenements, on Elizabeth Street in the Lower East Side in New York City, showing you, just where the lower class recent immigrant populations are going to end up in these crummy tenement buildings, which, again, we've just seen with Jacob Riis, so I don't want to belabor this. But unlike Riis, along with showing you their hardships, there is a component of Hines that really wanted to show you the ways that they persevered. And so, you'll see scenes of kids playing ball in alleys, amidst all of the things that were part of their difficult life, the clothing hanging outside. None of these kids are in school. Where are the parents? Keeping an eye on them and so forth, but still persevering. A rag picker from the Lower East Side in New York. It's probably a laundry woman, actually. Now we get to something that I think really made Lewis Hines' career for him. Starting in 1906 and all the way through 1918, Lewis Hines began to be a major photographer for the National Child Labor Committee. So there's, of course, this budding sociologist kind of movement, thinking about the way that we can use these studies of the social system to change the inequities in the world, which he was already a part of in his own teaching and schooling. But this also gets attached to a new series of municipal and sometimes government-run programs that were out there to stop the exploitation of child labor. Now, child labor laws, believe it or not, didn't really even start showing up until around 1904, and then they were very rarely really followed for a whole host of reasons, and I'll come back to this in a minute, and hardly ever, of course, policed. One of the reasons that they weren't followed so much is the same thing that we see the world over even today, which is there were all of these people, of course, in the United States who needed a job. They needed to make some money, and of course there are all these people who have industries that really need labor, and so you put the two together and they mutually support each other, although in a totally inequitable way, of course. Those who already have power and have the money will exploit those who don't, meaning not give them fair wages, work them very hard, and make massive profits off of them without sharing that in return. But those that don't have, of course, any other access to wealth kind of have to go along with the system, so they're not going to report on this. Now, for the most part, labor in the United States and people's sympathies for inequities in labor were, let's say, lukewarm at best. They didn't care so much if it was an adult that was being exploited, but a lot of people couldn't stand the idea of children being exploited. And so, sociologists and the labor movement, and in this case, the National Child Labor Committee, realized that a way to start kind of putting a wedge in the system to change people's minds about these inequities that occur in the workplace was to start with child labor, which most people were sympathetic to, right? They didn't want this to be occurring. So then Lewis Hines began showing up at these places that were exploiting children. He had to show up oftentimes in disguise. For instance, he posed as a fire inspector or a postcard vendor, Bible salesman, or an industrial photographer, like to photograph the machines. And then while he was there, he would clandestinely photograph scenes like this of children being used to make money for these businesses. Now, when he would do this, one of the tactics that he would use is, you can see it here, you can see the guy who's overseeing this, follow my cursor in the middle here, kind of the boss man, while all the children are basically preparing beans, a labor-intensive job. The hours that these kids would work are extreme, as were the hours that most of the poor worked, up to 12 hours a day, for pennies on the day. And many of the jobs that you'll see are extremely dangerous jobs that kids were doing. And of course today, I don't think we would put up with this stuff, and this is where the seeds of people not tolerating this type of exploitation of child labor began, and photography was very important to this. As Hines once put it in this famous quote, The picture is the language of all nationalities and all ages. The average person believes implicitly that photography cannot falsify. This unbounded faith in the integrity of the photograph is also often rudely shaken, for while photographers may not lie, liars may photograph. It becomes necessary then, in our revelation of the truth, to see to it that the camera we depend on contracts no bad habits. This led him then to the kind of straight idea of the photographic document that we've been critiquing a little bit, right? He wanted these photographs to capture the scene, to be, not falsified, no, multiple contact prints, no manipulation in the dark room, no stage photographs. Everything is a kind of snapshot of the scene as he finds it. He tried to instill in these scientific methods as well, in as much as that was possible. Many of these photographs you'll see children photographed against the machines that they were using so that you can see their scale. He would document the conditions meticulously as a scientist. For instance, he even, on the buttons of his shirt, had his buttons every 12 inches so that he could stand next to a kid and very quickly measure their height relative to their age. That could give you a sense of whether they had been malnourished and so forth. So he was trying to accompany the photographs with kind of pure science at the time. So we're going to go through a series of these. This is Neil Gallagher, who worked 2 years as a breaker. Breaker boys were kids who worked in coal mines, separating coal from its impurities. It was an incredibly dangerous activity, both in terms of developing what was known as black lung, inhaling coal dust, as well as all the problems that come along with mining. And so here he is documenting this kid who has lost his leg. A glass worker, even today, glass working is something that is incredibly dangerous. Ask any kind of glass artist. Here's this little kid who's working as a glass worker during the nights. A spinner, we don't think of this as, I don't suppose, dangerous today, but these tools that were used to spin yarn and spin thread, oftentimes people lost limbs in these, and here you have this little kid. Notice how Lewis Hines here has set her up right next to the machines that she's using, that in this case are turned off, to give you a sense of her scale, how small she is. And then when she was gone, he would actually measure this. There are oftentimes accompanying measuring devices on these tools so that you could see how big these kids were. And I'll just take you through some of these kids at work. This was a way to gather evidence too, right? You gather enough of this, you publish these in reports and in text, and I'll start talking about some of the major text of these in a moment. And through so many examples of these horrible activities, people's minds start to change about how they're going to kind of detach from this issue and actually people start kind of working to change the social circumstances of people. So here's Leo. He's 8 inches high. He's 8 years old, and his job is to pick up bobbins. He makes 15 cents in a 12-hour day. Right? It gives you a sense of the scale here, how big she is, this giant machine that she's working with. Everyone already knew the danger of these things. And again, this would be accompanied with basic sociological research when it was published. I'm going to show you a couple of these in a minute, but just stop and kind of think about this. If these kids are working at this point and not going to school, how are they ever going to change their lot in life, right? You can see this kind of clandestine picture being taken. He often had cameras in his coats with a buttonhole for the, it's like an old spy movie, right? With a buttonhole for the lens that he would take pictures from. These are some of those breaker boys, like the boy who lost his leg down here in the mines, basically by hand extracting the impurities of coal from coal itself. Now, you need manual labor for this, and I think you know the coal mines were making boatloads of money off of this cheap labor and not taking much care of their labor force. Glass blowing, look at this kid when he's right in the midst of something that's incredibly dangerous. And then I want to read you something about this one, because this is the kind of language that would accompany these situations. This is a young girl. They're shuckers, oyster shuckers. So they're taking the meat out of an oyster shell, 12 hours a day or so, manual labor, very intense, getting paid almost nothing, right? Not quite, let's say, as dangerous when it comes to losing a limb as some of the other activities that you've seen. But, you know, this little girl is going to grow up with no other possibilities in her life other than manual labor, likely. And so there's a story where President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, actually comes to one of these shucker areas, which were, you know, very, very, I should have put this in there too. They smell horrible. They're not very clean. People contracted diseases all the time there. And he's so kind of overwhelmed by the smell that he has to spit, and people actually reported on this. And then Hine, accompanying photos like this with reports of people who had been there, had this particular quote for these photographs. I'm just going to read you this verbatim. Quote, "What is your name, little girl?" So look at this little girl. "Dunno." "How old are you?" "Dunno." And the pity of it is that they do not know. What then do they know? Enough to stand patiently with the rest, picking up the hard, dirty clusters of shell, deftly prying them open, dropping the meat into the pot, and then to go through this process with another and another and another until after many minutes the pot is full. A relief she can carry it over to the waiter and the rest, doing nothing a minute for a minute, and walk back. Such a change from the dreary standing, reaching, prying, dropping, minute upon minute, hour upon hour, day upon day, month after month. Or perchance, for variety, the catch might have been shrimp, and then the hours are shorter, but the shrimp are icy and cold, and the blood of one's fingers congeals, and the fingers become so sore that they welcome the oysters again. So as we were talking about last week, it's worth remembering that, of course, a photograph tells a story in a kind of very, very loose way. Or another way to put this is it captures a scene of, in this case, figures in an oyster shucking situation or a shucking operation. But it doesn't really encode that image entirely. The meaning is variable. The meaning is open. So, for instance, when we stand in front of this photograph, depending on our own ideological positions, that photograph will mean something different probably to a lot of us. Let's say you were someone who thought that the working classes kind of had it coming, right? They didn't work hard. They were shiftless. They were lazy. They weren't very smart. Then you would look at this and be disgusted by these people. But if you're someone like me who feels that, these people haven't been given a fair shake, and unless we do something to change their lot in life, to interrupt, as Lewis Hines would put it, the system that just kind of perpetuates this inequity, then nothing's going to change, right? So in this case, accompanying these types of photographs with statistics, with this kind of quotation that you just read, is a way of encoding and limiting the meaning of this work by way of a discourse or a text that accompanies it. The other contextualizing of these, of course, is how they are distributed. And these were distributed in reports, and they become distributed over and over again in something that is a periodical that first starts off known as the Survey Graphic, which was a very kind of socialist-leaning broadside report that would come out as a weekly newsletter. It's a kind of magazine, a cheap magazine. Then that the name of that turned to something known as the Charities and the Commons. Charity, of course, was a big idea for any reformist. You put enough pressure on people's kind of moral guilt compass, maybe they'll give money to change this, or give their time, or use their power to change it. And then finally, the Charities and the Commons get associated with something known as the Pittsburgh Survey. Now, the Pittsburgh Survey is a really interesting study. It was a study done of Pittsburgh starting in 1907, maybe a little bit before that, in which they took Pittsburgh as a kind of standard industrial city with all kinds of labor issues and working class poor involved, and lots of inequities in labor. And they studied as much as they could have about this kind of case study of Pittsburgh. And first of all, these studies were showing up in the Charities and the Common, but then the Pittsburgh Survey became so big that they just titled the Charities and the Common the Pittsburgh Survey itself. So documenting child labor could be something as, corporations taking advantage of people. Could also be things like this. Of course, every boy wanted to be a messenger boy or to sell newspapers because it gave them a little bit more independence, and maybe there's a little bit more mobility. Look at this kid. How old is he supposed to be here? Smoking already. Certainly not in school, but with a little bit nicer clothes than maybe some of the others because this is a bit more lucrative trade. The famous, and you see this in all period movies, don't you? Newsboy learning his sales pitch to try to get those people to buy his newspapers, making money based upon the number of sales that he makes. Notice he doesn't have any shoes on there. And these are other newsies, the newsboys at Skeeter Branch in St. Louis, Missouri. It's a weird form of exploitation, right? So these kids realize pretty quickly on that they can make more money the more hours they work, and so why go to school when you really need money if you've got this avenue or seeming avenue towards making some money? But of course, it's a bit of a dead end, isn't it? So the place that these things turned up again were in periodicals. First, this major periodical known as Charities and the Commons, which then becomes the Pittsburgh Survey. And you see it here. It's sociology accompanied with the photographs of Lewis Hines and others. Lewis Hines did photographs in a number of different ways. He did something known as time exposures, where he would take an issue and look at it from multiple different perspectives using photographs and different types of narratives. So for instance, you might look at the way that I've been putting this, why a kid might want a particular job and to go along with it. Then you would look at it from the standpoint of why a parent might not step in to put that kid in school, and you might look at it from the standpoint of a corporation or an industry and what they how they dealt with this issue and what was in it for them. Just wanted to show you, where these things show up. And again, by 1909, cheap halftone prints in these periodicals was available. Now they're not, like a beautiful Alfred Stieglitz print, but their purpose wasn't to be beautiful or to be artistic. It was to show you something. So again, the Charities and the Commons. The other thing that Lewis Hines often did were these kind of didactic photo collages. So in this case, 1 year's work accidents and what they cost. Or posters that could go up all around town. And this one comes from the survey, the Pittsburgh Survey, of these injustices. So this is another photo collage that he made called Making Human Junk. You take small kids who, of course, have in a perfect world, they have unlimited possibilities for their own growth. But in this world that we live in, you know, you put them into a factory, and the factory, of course, is in it to make money, and those kids get exploited, and those humans get turned from good raw material into junk. And are we going to really trust industry, as he puts it at the end, to take this cost, make this cost on society? Another one of these didactic posters, right? What do they make in Alabama? Lumber, cotton goods, iron, steel, and others, $145 million a year. But who are we ignoring? These workers that are making nothing off of this. So he works on this for a while, and he takes a little bit of a hiatus. And then it had always been of interest to Lewis Hines to document also, as I kind of started out here saying, to document what he thought was kind of the wealth of America, or the wealth of the United States, the worker, the human worker, who he wanted to show in a kind of heroic way. And so along with showing all of these pictures of the inequities of the labor system, he also tried to show you these humanized portraits of workers. So a steel worker here from Pittsburgh. And remember those photographs I showed you recently in the group around Alfred Stieglitz and camera work of industrialized scenes. These are playing with that a little bit. A powerhouse mechanic working on a steam pump here. The background of that beautiful steam pump is something you might see in a Stieglitz circle work, but in this case, Hines' intention is to show you the heroism and strength of the American worker that will persevere and that needs to be supported, right? That we need to help these people out and not allow business to exploit them. Eventually, this interest, I wouldn't say culminates, but many people are aware of this. It certainly is one of his last major ventures, Lewis Hines, where he creates a book known as Men at Work, which has to do with the building of the Empire State Building and these incredible photographs of the building of this incredible building. Now, he's not going to focus on all the deaths that occurred in this. He very well could have, of course. What he has chosen to do instead is to show you the labor force at work and its accomplishments in creating this amazing structure that continues today to be one of the most visited sites in Manhattan. Now, there's a lot of questions out there as to how many of these photographs might be fictionalized. I'm not going to get into that. It doesn't seem to be entirely proven, or at least I haven't seen the proof yet. So I'm just going to treat these as real photographs. It certainly makes them more magical if you see that. And some of these I think you'll recognize, right? So this is Lewis Hines sitting on one of these girders well above the skyline with his handheld camera getting ready to take a picture. And these are the types of pictures he took. Now, there are almost always scenes that will show you the daring of these workers, right? How fearless they are in the face of obvious peril. Things that focus on the worker first, and then his accomplishments, in a way, in the background. All of these buildings that were similarly built by workers, right? The heroization of the working people. One of the best known ones, and one of the ones that's most controversial, is the one that a lot of people think was fictionalized, is this one. Everyone's sitting on this I-beam during lunch, just apparently unworried about this. It gives me vertigo even to look at it now, right? Not fictionalized. The Chrysler building in the background, and look at how tall the Empire State Building is in comparison. And this got published in this famous book, Men at Work. Okay, we're going to pause here. I'm going to pause here for a minute again, excuse me. Okay, So we're going to continue on now, talking about kind of documentary photography, or photography using as a document and a report to lead to social change, by looking at one of the big and very well studied moments in the middle of the century during the Great Depression. This is the photography that was produced by what later became known as the Farm Security Administration, which was an arm of the federal government that was housed under what was known as the Resettlement Administration. Now, the most important part of this is, for those of you who don't already know, starting in 1929, the United States suffered a Great Depression that will last basically all the way up till World War II, starting with a great stock market crash, and then, of course, leading to a series of really difficult moments, particularly for rural workers. If you've read or seen any period movies like The Grapes of Wrath or something of that sort, you know that in the 1930s in particular, because first of all, we suffered a massive drought in various parts of the United States. The economy was in the toilet. That a lot of rural people decided that their best course of action was to resettle to various urban centers. This was facilitated under the Resettlement Administration as part of the New Deal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to help these rural poor out. After all, because of the drought, because of various agricultural practices that led to the Dust Bowl, where for years the major agricultural centers couldn't produce any crops, these people didn't really have many alternatives. Now, as part of the Farm Security Administration, and originally part of the Resettlement Administration, a number of figures who were associated with sociology took over the department that was in charge of basically sharing with the American public some of the difficulties that people were going through, as well as kind of drumming up support for Roosevelt's New Deal, because it wasn't always supported by everyone. And the major character, the major kind of sociologist here, a guy who was at Columbia University, was Roy Stryker, who basically was pretty bright at bringing together some really important photographers who had all been already practicing. They'd all been working in one realm or another. Many of them had their own kind of portrait studios, but those were destroyed by the Great Depression. They couldn't make money that way. He brought them together and he sent them out on assignment in various parts of the United States to document what they found. Although, of course, a documentation is not just a unthought of snapshot. They were given jobs to do. Now, Roy Stryker was pretty broad with his directives. He basically sent various very famous photographers such as Russell Lee, Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein, and then later on Gordon Parks, to different areas of the United States to find what they could find there. He trusted them to a great degree to take the photos as they came across them, to develop these photographs in the field, to send them back with captions that then could be edited and published by the Farm Security Administration in various forms. The other thing, though, that came of this over the years that this was in operation, 10-ish years, not quite 10 years, is that they produced over 270,000 negatives that were available to anyone who wanted to use them for no charge. The idea was you had this repository of all of this documentary photography that then could be put to use, right, by newspapers, by magazines, whoever wanted to get the rights to these, to show in their own way, this situation that was occurring in the United States. So we're going to look at a few of these photographers and talk about this moment in time. So first one on our list is Russell Lee. Most of these photographers that you'll see were very highly trained by artist photographers. Many of them worked under Clarence White at Columbia University, who was in the Stieglitz circle, Russell Lee being one of those. And Russell Lee, like so many of these people, you know, his job was first in New York City to document the unemployed there, so you get photographs like this. And then in rural areas of the East Coast to go by and take pictures of what he found. Now, what I want to point out about this is, on the one hand, these people were given jobs to do. They were given kind of little locales and various people to go to photograph. And then Stryker would send out these broad directives, such as, you know, this was a directive to another photographer, but it doesn't matter. He'd say, be sure to go to the railway station, quote, wait for the train to come in, get them loading baggage cars, show the people hanging around the railroad station, to give you a sense of how many people were leaving these areas. Or, as he said elsewhere, in the photographing of a main street such as this, be sure to get the signs in the windows and go to a food store and show how much things cost, right? What is he trying to show you here? He's trying to show you, you know, the economy as it's collapsing. He's trying to show you the way that America, which once was the land of plenty, you see part, you know, billboard sign over there of Heinz 57 ketchup, a kind of booming moment of plenty, this food next to this dilapidated house with very few people in it, that looks boarded up, that looks very, you know, looks very poor and destitute, and this is the type of photography that you get. Once again, what we have been kind of trying to wrap our minds around and get some fluency in and get some kind of complexity in is, in what way do we think of these things as documents? And hopefully what we're getting at here over and over again is, you know, nothing is a pure document. Everything comes from a very, you know, or at least one, if not more, ideological perspectives. And the perspective on these is pretty clear. We want to show the difficulty of the people of this time. We want to show, you know, people who are hurting. We want to show that. And so we start with that subject. We depict it in a way that is going to play that up, like go find a billboard that shows people like lots of great food next to a place that looks like they haven't had that kind of food in a long time. And then, of course, it is shown in a very particular context with particular verbiage with it and so forth. But Stryker knew this. Like, that's what he was up to. That was what he thought photography should be. As a matter of fact, to give you another quote, he said, you know, we're introducing Americans to Americans. And he summed up what he saw as the difference between his strategy and that of the print media this way. Quote, news pictures are the noun and verb. Our kind of photography is the adjective and the adverb. The news picture is a single frame, ours a subject viewed in series. The news picture is dramatic, all subject and action. Ours show what's back of the action. So, a very famous picture by Russell Lee, the aftermath of a flood in Mount Vernon, Indiana. So here you see, you know, this crazy time of the Dust Bowl, where you went from incredible droughts to then, of course, huge floods. And here, for no known reason, there's an organ out in the middle of a field that one presumes floated away. And look at how he set this up. It's almost like an architectural ruin in the foreground amidst the completely unproductive land around it that couldn't possibly grow anything, as an insignia or a kind of symbol of the difficulty in this part of the world at this time. Also, by 1937, Stryker wasn't just interested in having these photographers show you the difficulty of, you know, the rural populations. He decided that he wanted these photographers to show anything they could of what was going on in America at the time. And so we get these photographs that, show you, for instance, racial inequities in Jim Crow South in Oklahoma, where, colored people, as they were called, were forced to drink out of certain water and whites out of other water. Again, one of the things that's so, it seems to me, effective about photography is that you can say to someone over and over again, America was racist, and people kind of get the idea of that in their head in an intellectual way. But when you show them a photograph of some of the ways that racism showed up in the world, even if it's staged, right? Even if you got this guy and said, go drink some water so I can get you in this picture, it's still very visceral and real. It still makes you realize that this was really the case. Or to show, kids, in this case, people of color, learning the basics of arithmetic here. One of the most famous photographers of this group was Dorothea Lange, who had her own portrait studio in California and was married to a fairly prominent artist who she later divorced, by the way. But she was part of kind of the artistic circle until the Great Depression, where she was recruited by Stryker to come be a part of the Farm Security Administration. Dorothea Lange's job was to photograph people in California, particularly people who were from the East or Mid-East, who were moving to California in search of farm labor jobs. And so, here's a photograph of Dorothea Lange in 1934 with her handheld camera heading off on assignment. Here's what these people's lives probably looked like. The photographers were on the road traveling from settlement to settlement in search of more photographs of the difficulty of these people. So you can see that she's got everything stacked on that car. And, anything you came across that was an indication of the state of affairs in the United States at the time is something that you took a photograph of, you developed it in the field, and you sent it off to Washington to be put to use. So look at this photograph here. This is your country. Don't let the big men take it away from you. I mean, it's just filled with significance, isn't it? Or what do we make of this photograph, right? Who is this guy? The sheriff in Oklahoma from 1937 in a city that looks like no one else lives there, out in front of the jail. Is this a ghost city? Is this a commentary on, the South at this time with only the whites still sticking around? What is she trying to get at here? What she becomes best known for, though, are these, and it probably comes from her career as a portrait photographer, are these close-up pictures of the workers. So here's a migratory cotton picker in Arizona from 1940, one of her later pictures. And, if we were, let's say, John Sarkowski, and we were looking at this from the standpoint of a formalist, we might point out the photographic detail and the wonderful composition and the way that this is all lit, and that is important stuff, but we would be missing what she's trying to get at, which is, what do those things mean? What has this man been reduced to? Look at those hands and how cracked and worn they are. How this gesture of putting his hand across his face can be taken on the one hand as something anonymous and also as something that indicates his maybe a shyness here, or not wanting to be seen in this light, or what have you. What do we make of this photograph? Again, at the time point, she is photographing what she comes across, and here we have a plantation owner in his field hands here, the white guy, with his foot on a car, someone who can still own a car, and the people of color in the background who have no other opportunity other than to work for this guy. Now, we don't know if he's a horrible racist, but this work will participate in codes of meaning that are built into us. If we've seen enough of these, where the white person has, where we've seen photographs of a black man having to drink out of a different water fountain, we're likely to think of this as an inequitable situation where these people of color are being exploited. Scenes of the Dust Bowl, right? Of all the ways that we overworked the land, and with the, of course, the droughts that were occurring made this land not very productive for years and years to come. These furrowed fields, which otherwise would be growing things, are completely empty, and the forlorn kind of empty, isolated shack that looks uninhabited in the background. All significant, right? All chosen to say something, but chosen from something that actually existed. People in a bread line, migrant workers, children affected by these scenes. Closer to home here in Wapato, which is over by Yakima here. So you can see the photographic negative here that would be sent back to Washington, and then caption, given a title by people depending on how they wanted to use these. And then one of the most famous photographs from this period, the so-called migrant mother here. And you'll know what this is. So these are two frame stills before she actually sets up the shot. It is, of course, a at least partially staged photograph of someone that she came across here. And so, excuse me here for a minute while I plug in. Let me pause for a second. So this photograph then that most people are familiar with is this one. And I've got a fairly long quote on this, so I want to give that to you first. This is called The Migrant Mother, 1936. She took these pics to a newspaper immediately, which were sent to the United Press, and immediately calls for government aid and help went out. And because of the power of this photograph, a lot of money was sent to help out this particular migrant community. So these things are obviously effective, and of course we know that, and you can talk about these things today. I don't know how many times a photograph gets published these days, usually on the internet, right, in one social media or another, and pretty quickly someone sets up a site where you can donate money, and people will send money based upon the effectiveness of photographs. So in this case, she said, she put her experience of this way. She was out on the road, and she drove by a crude sign saying "Pea Pickers Camp." As she put it, quote, "I didn't want to stop and didn't." She said about 20 miles later, she made a U-turn and returned to the camp. "I was, quote, following instinct, not reason. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. She asked no questions. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and from birds that the children killed. She seemed to know my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it. I knew I had recorded the essence of my assignment." As I said, Lane then took these pictures to a newspaper editor who contacted the United Press, which informed the government authorities, who then took action to help. The headline of March 10th, 1936 edition of the San Francisco News, this is just outside of San Bernardino, by the way, proclaimed, quote, "Food rush to starving farm colony." So why is this then so effective, right? Why does this one work? Why did people feel drawn into this one? I'm just going to offer a couple of ideas there, but you'll have to play with it too. One of them is that this photograph seems really familiar in some ways. Those of you who know the history of art will probably recognize that the woman is set up with these two children flanking her in a way that is reminiscent of paintings of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child and John the Baptist or whoever else. But of course she's in turmoil. She's in a difficult situation. It doesn't hurt either that she's got enough kind of desperation on her face to make us feel her difficulty, right? But not too much. It's not too overpowering. It doesn't hurt too that she's let's put it this way, a handsome woman, an attractive woman here, that the amount of, for instance, wornness of her clothes isn't so much that it disgusts us, nor so little that it doesn't feel like she's really in a difficult place. And that the children are kind of hiding their heads. Is that a symbol of shame, a symbol of not being able to bear the situation? All of these things come together, and many other factors in this to make this one of those photographs that really continues to live for a lot of people. So I'll just show you some more of these pictures accompanied by her notes, right? And remember, Stryker, get some of the pictures that show you the signs here, fruits and vegetables, fish, and so forth, when, of course, everything looks vacant. No one can afford these things. Again, some promotional literature for the WPA programs. Then in the 1940s, in one of those moments that's a real black spot on American policy, with the rise of World War II, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Many of you know that Japanese Americans, right, nationals, were gathered up and put on internment camps across the United States. This was known as Executive Order 9066, and Dorothea Lange was one of a number of photographers who documented some of the racism that went along with this. So this is a Dorothea Lange photograph of a obviously racist billboard at the time. And of course all of this nationalism that went along with the war-torn country. And she documented the nationals themselves. Remember, these are American citizens who happen to come from Japanese ancestry. That because we were so afraid of the idea that they might be spies or might rise up against us, not even understanding that, of course, at this point they're Americans, they're U.S. citizens. They were gathered up, their properties were oftentimes taken from them, and they were forced on basically the American equivalent of concentration camps. The other major figure, the one that most people know about during this time period, and a member of the Farm Security Administration, is Walker Evans. Now, Walker Evans is most famous for these kind of deadpan photographs of people in rural Alabama, which is primarily where he worked. They're straight-up photographs of these rural Americans, usually set against their house or a minimal background that, again, are supposed to come across as a little bit deadpan. They don't really have a great deal of emotive quality to them, or rather their emotive quality is really simple. So this is Allie Mae Burroughs, Hale County, Alabama. This is the Burroughs family, again, set up in front of their simple home here, documenting them. Could be any family photo, frankly. He took photographs of people that tended to have this kind of, for me anyway, this little bit of ambivalence to them. You never are quite sure. This is a man who is very well educated, who came from a fairly rich family, whether there's something of a little bit of skepticism about his own job sometimes. Here is, the interior of a miner's home, decorated with whatever you can get a hold of, I suppose. And then some of his most famous photographs. Sharecropper, Hale County, Alabama, here, standing in front of his home again with his bandana over his shoulders. He looks very gaunt. He still looks, somewhat proud, like so many of these photographs by Walker Evans, but obviously in a pretty difficult situation here. His name's Floyd Burroughs, by the way, and you'll see a lot of him in the Burroughs family. This is the whole family and their simple interior. Again, the job here is for Walker Evans to get these photographs to send back to the Farm Security Administration, but he also had another idea in mind for these. Walker Evans, in 1936, began to collaborate with James Agee, who was a writer, a reporter, on a project intended for Fortune magazine, which was one of the big periodical magazines that showed a lot of photographs. It was supposed to be these pictures of tenant farmers in Hale County, Alabama. They have eventually, after a lot of work, rejected this, and later on, these series of photographs, which you're looking at here, many of these, became a part of a book that's one of the most famous books produced during this time, a photo book known as Let Us Now Praise Famous Men from 1941. Now, this is a really interesting book. If you get a chance to check out a copy of this from the library, it starts just with photograph after photograph after photograph, and then at the end you see text, and the text is somewhat independent from the photographs themselves. It's not text right along with the photograph that immediately encodes it. You have to go through all the photographs, think about what they're saying to you. I mean, what does this one say to you? It says difficult life, young children, worn, weathered shoes. What's their life going to be like? And then these things, after you'd look through all of them, this is Bud Fields, would have the text associated with it. This almost looks like a formalist work, and in some ways there's a lot of formalism to Walker Evans' choice in the way that he frames subjects, but it's also a work of art whose main, at least governing starting point, was to show you the austerity of this way of life. Difference between those people and someone who has money. And Floyd Burroughs, one of the most famous photographs of this time, this is kind of like the male equivalent of the migrant mother. Floyd Burroughs, tenant farmer in Alabama, very difficult life, obviously, clothes falling apart here, but still having this kind of inner energy or spirit, rugged, handsome, strong, persevering, and so forth. Versus, again, the austerity of this way of life, a kitchen wall. How much do things cost right now, right? Who's buying stuff? Here you see people trying to sell, but who has the money to pay for this? Now again, as I said, these things all got put together, not all of them, a lot of these photographs that you're probably very familiar with got put together in this famous text that, by the way, wasn't famous. When it was first produced, there was only 100 copies and it didn't sell, but later it was reissued and caught on then, and now it's one of the most sought after text out there. Started out with all these photographs and then had text at the end. And I'll just give you some kind of extended quote from this text that comes at the end. The nominal subject is North American cotton tenantry as examined in the daily living of 3 representative white tenant families. Actually, the effort is to recognize the stature of a portion of unimagined existence and to contrive techniques proper to its recording, communication, analysis, and defense. More essentially, this is an independent inquiry into certain normal predicaments of human divinity. The immediate instruments are two, the motionless camera and the printed word. The governing instrument, which is also one of the centers of the subject, is individual anti-authoritative human consciousness. Ultimately, it is intended that this record and analysis be exhaustive, with no detail, however trivial it may seem, left untouched, no relevancy avoided, which lies within the power of remembrance to maintain, of the intelligence to perceive, and of the spirit to persist in. And this is what you would see in that book. So let's end with a couple of other, a few more characters here. Arthur Rothstein. Arthur Rothstein was primarily out in the Dakotas and Oklahoma on assignment there. Much the same as the other workers. He's out in his car, kind of living as he travels, and documenting what he finds. A fleeing dust storm in Oklahoma, for instance, here. What he got most famous for, though, is unfortunate, and it's frankly one of the things that I'm using here to show you the problematic of the idea of the document itself, right? This is a famous photograph, usually known as a skull near Pennington, South Dakota, from 1936, where Arthur, what he did was he saw the skull in this cracked earth. It was, interesting to him. So he took the skull and he moved it around a little and took another photograph, moved it around again, took another photograph, stuck it next to something else, took another photograph of it. And then, of course, he just sent this off to Washington, where it got put to use associated with the drought and death and so forth. And people who were, let's say, antagonistic towards the New Deal, antagonistic towards government programs to help people out, seized upon this because they could see the other negatives as a fake, and said this is a fake, and look at how photography is being used to manipulate us, when of course Rothstein in the first place wasn't thinking of this as being put to use to document, let's say, the drought. He was just thinking of it as kind of, he's out on assignment, he's going to make a interesting photo. So let me give you this quote on this. He said, quote, "What I had done, was that I was driving through South Dakota in the Badlands area, and I found this place that looked so interesting. The sunlight and the skull and the cracked dirt, and I started playing around, like an artist photographer would. And I took pictures of the skull with the light this way and the shadows this way, and I dragged it over about 10 feet to a clump of cactus and took it with the cactus and so forth. And I did this in the spring in May, before there was a drought. But the pictures were in the government files in Washington. In July, when there was a severe drought, a picture editor for the Associated Press by the name of Max Hill, who had never been out west, saw this picture and said, 'This is the symbol of the drought.' And so he sent it out and syndicated it all over the country, and of course it was wrong. It was something that you could find any time of the year, and so everyone accused me of being a fraud, a Hollywood cameraman." Poor guy. Now I want to kind of end it with a couple of different things. Gordon Parks is someone who is famous as a photographer, as a director. Some of you know him better as the director for Shaft, for instance. He's also a man of color who was basically recruited by Stryker in the early 40s. And when he worked for Stryker, there's two things going on. He got famous early on for doing this photograph. This is a photograph of Ella Watson, that's usually known as American Gothic. The title, of course, comes from that famous painting, American Gothic by Grant Wood, which is all about Midwestern values and American kind of symbolism. But in this case, what he's doing is he's taking a woman who worked as a janitor for government agencies, and he's associating her in the background with this flag, and of course with being a woman of color who is basically a worker bee in a system that doesn't treat her as an equal, and she has very little ability, of course, to have any social mobility or access to wealth and so forth. Now, he took this photograph. It's obviously staged, right, to make a point. He wants to say something, and he took it to Stryker. And Stryker, although incredibly impressed by this, said, I can't use this. It's too politically inflammatory. But he sent him off on assignment to document the kind of things that he thought would be, and by he, I mean Stryker, would be more useful to the cause. So here's Ella Watson at home with her grandchildren, for instance, reading a book to them in their home, a simple home. It's got all the symbols that are meant to tug at your heartstrings. She's probably reading, a Bible on the walls. You see Christian symbols of Jesus there. It's got the little babies who are, so precious, and you want to take care of them in this kind of simple home. Ella Watson and her grandchildren again, taking care of them, documenting then. And this wasn't something that showed up in a lot of the other photographers' works, the life of people of color during this time period. Right? It says two kids with a doll. I mean, it's so resonant here. These people of color, and of course the doll that they have, it can't help be pointed out, is a white doll. There weren't, of course, many dolls of color out there. Or people waiting on the stoop. Looks like everything else is deserted here. Workers, welders in this case, young men trying to find a way in the world. Kids on the street. And Gordon Parks, of course, made this his job, to go document the people of color and the effect on their lives. Crying kids, Ella Watson coming down her stairs, people returning from the army. And then, of course, in the 1960s, Gordon Parks' work takes a big turn. I mean, he began to really embrace the idea of standing up for kind of revolutionary policies rather than just policies that were going to be reformist. And many of the people that he photographed were major players in, of course, these revolutionary moments. Malcolm X being one of them. He also photographed various members of the Black Panther Party. I love this one because you can probably see the symbolism. If you don't know who Malcolm X is, he's of course, one of the major civil rights leaders coming after Martin Luther King, who agitated for a more kind of direct activist and sometimes straightforward, physically aggressive policy against inequities in the world. He wasn't the peaceful protester that you associate with Martin Luther King. And here he is supposedly selling newspapers, but look at what's on there. It's police brutality towards people of color, which I think most of us know hasn't gone away in our own world. And notice how he's holding that paper, I must say. But he also just showed you scenes and took basically pictures of Malcolm X at work and people associated with civil rights movements and major American icons, people of color, including, of course, this man that I think most of you know, Muhammad Ali. I wanted to end here just very briefly with a couple of works by Arthur Felig, or Ouija as he became known. Ouija is one of those guys who basically, I mean, I want to be nice about this, but basically most of the way he got famous were for these kind of street photographs that are sensationalist. They're documenting scenes of atrocities. He would follow around the police and get to the scene right when they did and take pictures so he could sell them to newspapers. He was on the hunt, like paparazzi are today, for stars on the street. And that was his job. So here you see him with his speed graphic camera. This is a camera that has a reusable flash on it and could take really quick shutter speed photographs of scenes in the dark, so they could run around and capture these scenes. And so, for instance, this scene, Murder in Hell's Kitchen, the gun dropped in the foreground and the dead body there. You know, this is its own form of documentation. He's not doing this, or at least my point in showing this is that he didn't see his job as showing you scenes of the horror of the world so that you'd change them. He seems to be wanting to document this due to a kind of more prurient interest, which is sensationalism. People buy graphic pictures of horrible scenes, and we'll see these things returned, by the way, in some of the work or the way that Andy Warhol put photographs to use in his own American Disaster series. Booking scenes, scenes of horror. A lot of his works are, they're very funny. This one in particular, the critic of, you know, these two people who have with their tiaras, and look at the woman off to the right and what the relationship of all that is. And then one of his most famous scenes are the scenes of Coney Island Beach in New York from 1940. We'll see the pop artists actually take this Ouija photograph and well, first of all, popular culture made it into a shag carpet with the print of all this kind of black and white. And he turned all of these things into his famous book called Naked City, with photographs by himself. Well, I hope you've had fun with this week. It's a lot of ground to cover, which is why we've only got one module here right now. All right, talk to you later.